In March 2023, Saudi Arabia completed an oil transaction with a Chinese refiner. The payment arrived in yuan. No White House statement followed. No emergency meeting of the G7. No breaking news alert. The deal cleared quietly and the world moved on. But the transaction broke a 50-year rule, and the rule it broke was the foundation of American financial power since 1974. You're watching Noob Historian. The official story is the first lie. The money trail is the first truth. The rule went like this. If you want oil, you pay in dollars. No exceptions. Every country on Earth, from Germany to Japan to India, had to hold American dollars before it bought the energy it needed to keep its economy running. This arrangement did not happen by accident. It did not emerge from free markets or natural economic forces. It was designed, negotiated in secret, and sealed between Henry Kissinger and the Saudi royal family in the summer of 1974. The terms of this agreement sit in the public record. Declassified cables from Kissinger's State Department are held at the National Security Archive at George Washington University. The Treasury Department's internal mechanics appeared in documents released under the Freedom of Information Act and published by Bloomberg in 2016. These documents confirm what the official story always denied. The U.S. government engineered a system to force global demand for its currency by tying it to the one commodity every nation on Earth needed. This video traces the system from its creation to its current condition. You will see the documented evidence of what was agreed in 1974. You will see the mechanics of how petrodollar recycling worked in practice. You will see the IMF data showing the dollar's reserve share falling from 73% in 2001 to 58% in 2023. You will see the primary source filings from Saudi Aramco and China's TNOOC documenting the first yuan-denominated oil trades. And you will see the historical parallel from Britain's sterling area dissolution from 1931 to 1956, which gives us the only documented roadmap for what a reserve currency transition looks like across multiple decades. None of this requires prediction. The evidence is already in the record. Start with the problem Kissinger inherited. To understand the 1974 deal, you need to understand the crisis it solved. In July 1944, representatives from 44 Allied nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The war was not yet over. The architects of the post-war financial system were already at work. The agreement they produced gave the post-war order its name, the Bretton Woods system. Its foundational rule was simple. The US dollar was pegged to gold at $35 per troy ounce. Every other currency pegged to the dollar. Gold anchored the entire structure. The logic was clean in 1944. The United States held approximately 70% of the world's monetary gold reserves at the time of the conference. Fort Knox contained roughly 20,205 tons of gold at the system's peak. Any nation holding dollars had a legal right to exchange those dollars for gold at the fixed rate. This gave the dollar its credibility. It was, in contractual terms, as good as gold. The system worked as long as the United States ran its finances with discipline. It did not do this. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, and President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society domestic spending programs created an enormous expansion of government expenditure through the 1960s. The U.S. printed dollars to fund this spending. Foreign governments and central banks watched the dollar supply grow while the gold stock did not. They began to question whether the gold backing remained real. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, became openly hostile to the arrangement. De Gaulle called the dollar's privileged position an exorbitant privilege and argued it allowed Americans to run deficits at the expense of everyone else. He was not wrong. Between 1965 and 1968, France converted approximately $150 million in dollar reserves to gold, physically demanding the metal and shipping it to Paris. By 1971, the arithmetic had broken. The United States held approximately $10 billion in gold reserves. Foreign governments held claims on approximately $35 billion in dollars. Any large-scale conversion demand would have emptied American gold supplies entirely. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on national television. He announced the suspension of the dollar's convertibility to gold. The announcement was framed as a defensive measure against international speculation. In functional terms, it was a default. The United States unilaterally broke the international agreement it had signed in 1944. The temporary suspension became permanent. The Bretton Woods system was finished. This created a problem of structural magnitude for American power. The dollar's value had rested on gold. Now it rested on nothing. Foreign governments held enormous dollar reserves with no hard asset backing them. The U.S. government still needed to finance its spending. It still needed foreign governments to buy treasury bonds. But the rationale for doing so had disappeared. The answer Nixon's Treasury Secretary John Connally gave foreign finance ministers was blunt. At a G10 meeting in Rome in November 1971, Connally told his European counterparts, "The dollar is our currency, but it's your problem." The United States needed to find a new anchor for the dollar. Not gold this time, something the entire world needed even more urgently than gold. Something no country, rich or poor, industrial or agricultural, east or west, was able to do without? The answer was oil. But the path to oil as the dollar's anchor required one more crisis to arrive first. It arrived in October 1973. The 1973 Arab oil embargo changed the terms of global power in 90 days. In October 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a military offensive against Israel in the Yom Kippur War. The United States provided emergency military aid to Israel. In response, the Arab members of OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia, announced an oil embargo against the United States and other nations supporting Israel. They cut production by 5% per month. The effect was immediate and severe. Oil prices rose from $3 per barrel in October 1973 to £12 per barrel by January 1974, a fourfold increase in less than 3 months. American gas stations ran out of fuel. Lines stretched for city blocks. The U.S. economy contracted sharply. European economies faced their worst energy crisis since World War II. The embargo demonstrated something the American government had not fully absorbed before 1973. Middle Eastern oil producers held a genuine operational veto over Western economic stability. A group of relatively small nations, by controlling the flow of a single commodity, brought the most advanced industrial economies in the world to a stop. Henry Kissinger, serving simultaneously as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, read this crisis as an opportunity. Kissinger was not an economist. He was a strategist trained in the analysis of great power competition, the balance of forces, and long-term structural advantage. He understood the relationship between military capacity and economic leverage. He also understood the problem facing the dollar after the Bretton Woods collapse. The dollar needed a new structural foundation. OPEC had proven it held the most valuable commodity on earth. Kissinger began designing a connection between these two facts. The National Security Archive at George Washington University holds the declassified cables from the period between January and July 1974. These cables document Kissinger's repeated trips to Riyadh. They document his meetings with King Faisal and Crown Prince Fahd. They document the terms negotiated. The structure of the deal was direct. The United States would provide Saudi Arabia with full military protection. This included defense guarantees, advanced weapon systems, and training for Saudi military forces. F-15 fighter jets, Hawk missile defense systems, and American military advisors for the Saudi National Guard were part of the package. The U.S. military umbrella would extend over the Arabian Peninsula. In exchange, Saudi Arabia would price all oil sales exclusively in U.S. dollars. No other currency would be accepted. Any nation buying Saudi oil, regardless of its own currency or bilateral trade relationship, would first need to obtain dollars. Saudi Arabia would also direct its surplus oil revenues into U.S. Treasury bonds. The Petrodollar surplus would recycle back into the American financial system. The agreement was formalized through joint commissions established in June 1974. The U.S.-Saudi Arabian Joint Commission on Economic Cooperation handled the public-facing economic components. The military arrangements moved through separate channels. The Treasury documents released through FOIA in 2016, examined in detail by the Bloomberg investigative team, show Treasury Secretary William Simon managing the bond buying arrangements directly with Saudi officials. They contain provisions specifically designed to keep the Saudi Treasury purchases secret from other investors to avoid disrupting bond markets. The word secret appears in the Treasury's own internal documents. Simon negotiated an arrangement under which Saudi purchases of U.S. Treasury securities were excluded from the standard public reporting requirements applied to all other foreign holders. This exclusion persisted for decades. Bloomberg's reporting confirmed both the exclusion and its scale. The consequences of this arrangement spread immediately through the global system. Saudi Arabia was OPEC's largest producer and its organizational leader. When Saudi Arabia committed to dollar-only oil pricing, other OPEC members followed. By 1975, the entire OPEC cartel priced oil in dollars. This created a global system with one inescapable logic. Every country needed oil to run its economy. Every country, therefore, needed dollars to buy oil. Every country, therefore, had to hold dollars in reserve. Global demand for the dollar became structurally guaranteed, independent of American economic performance or fiscal discipline. The dollar no longer needed gold. It had oil. American strategic power had achieved something without modern precedent. It had made its own currency the mandatory medium of exchange for the world's most critical commodity. The tax this imposed on the rest of the world was real and ongoing. Every country holding dollar reserves was, in effect, lending money to the United States at zero cost. Every central bank accumulating dollars to buy oil was financing American deficits without receiving interest. This is the mechanism behind the phrase exorbitant privilege, the same phrase de Gaulle had used before 1971. After 1974, the privilege did not disappear. It was rebuilt on new foundations, stronger foundations. Foundations built not from gold, which is finite and visible, but from oil, which the entire industrial world consumed daily. Understanding the mechanics of petrodollar recycling requires following the money through each step of the circuit. Start with a barrel of oil. In 1974, Saudi Arabia pumped approximately 8.5 million barrels per day. At $12 per barrel, this generated roughly $37 billion in annual oil revenues. By 1980, with prices at $35 per barrel and production higher, revenues exceeded $100 billion per year. Every dollar of this income came from foreign buyers who had first obtained dollars to complete the transaction. The dollars flowed to the Saudi Arabian Monetary Authority, known as SAMA, the kingdom's central bank. SAMA's primary challenge in the early years was managing the surplus. Saudi Arabia's domestic economy, with a population of roughly 7 million in 1974, had no capacity to absorb $37 billion per year domestically. The money required deployment elsewhere. Under the terms of the agreement with Kissinger and Simon, a substantial portion went to U.S. Treasury bonds. The precise amounts were shielded from public reporting, as the Bloomberg FOIA documents confirm, but the Treasury's own analyses from the period show the downstream effect. Between 1974 and 1981, foreign holdings of U.S. Treasury securities more than doubled. Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states accounted for a significant share of this growth. The mechanism operated in 4 sequential stages. In stage 1, an oil-importing country needed oil. Germany, Japan, South Korea, Brazil. It obtained dollars either from trade surpluses earned in dollars or by borrowing dollars in international markets. It paid Saudi Arabia in dollars. In stage 2, Saudi Arabia accumulated these dollar revenues at SAMA. Domestic spending requirements absorbed a portion of the total. The remainder formed the surplus pool available for recycling. In stage 3, SAMA, working with American banks and Treasury officials, directed the surplus into U.S. Treasury bonds, dollar-denominated deposits in New York and London financial institutions, and dollar-denominated investments in American corporations. The money returned to the United States. In stage 4, the United States used this returning capital to finance government deficits, military spending including the military commitment to Saudi Arabia itself and its broader current account deficit. American consumers purchased goods from around the world, paid in dollars, and those dollars eventually returned home through the petrodollar circuit. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York held a central operational role in this architecture. SAMA maintained accounts at the New York Fed. The arrangement gave the United States something no other country possessed: a structural guarantee of demand for its government bonds from foreign sovereigns operating independently of interest rates or creditworthiness assessments. This produced 2 specific consequences for American power. First, the United States gained the ability to run permanent trade and budget deficits without facing the currency crisis any other country would face in the same position. When a country spends more than it earns, its currency normally falls. Investors sell its bonds. Interest rates rise. The government is forced into austerity. This discipline applies to every country except the one whose currency the world needs to buy oil. The United States borrowed and spent, and the rest of the world kept buying its bonds because they needed dollars to buy energy. Second, the petrodollar system created the American sanctions architecture. The dollar's centrality in global trade meant the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control gained enormous coercive leverage. Any entity needing dollars to conduct international business was exposed to American financial pressure. Cutting a country off from dollar clearing at the New York Fed was operationally equivalent to cutting it off from the global economy. This weapon, deployed against Iran, Iraq, North Korea, and Russia, derived its effectiveness entirely from the petrodollar system. Without oil-denominated dollar demand, the weapon does not exist. The Bank for International Settlements 2022 Triennial Survey quantifies what 50 years of this architecture produced. The dollar appeared in 88% of all foreign exchange transactions globally. No other currency came close. The euro appeared in 31%, the Japanese yen in 17%, the Chinese renminbi in 7%. And when global banks exchanged currencies, they almost always went through dollars even when neither party to the transaction was American, and neither country was buying oil from OPEC. This dominance was not an outcome of free markets. It was an outcome of a specific agreement made in Washington and Riyadh in 1974. It was built on oil, and it is now showing the first documented fractures in its 50-year history. The architecture Kissinger built is now under documented structural stress. The evidence comes from 4 primary sources. These are the IMF's SOFR database, the BIS Triennial Survey, public filings from energy companies, and official communications from governments building alternative payment systems. Begin with the IMF data. The COFR database, the currency composition of official foreign exchange reserves, records what currencies central banks hold in their reserves. It is the most direct available measurement of the dollar's actual global role. In 2001, the dollar accounted for 73% of all foreign exchange reserves held by central banks worldwide. By the end of 2023, this figure had fallen to approximately 58%. a decline of 15 percentage points over 22 years. The IMF's own economists describe this as the steepest sustained decline in dollar reserve share since the dataset's records began. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what central bank reserves represent in practice. Central banks hold reserves to manage their own currencies. They intervene in foreign exchange markets when necessary. They maintain credibility with international creditors. Holding dollars means holding American financial infrastructure inside your own treasury. When central banks shift away from dollars, they reduce their structural dependence on systems the United States controls. The decline from 73 to 58% is not a collapse. It is a measured multi-decade retreat. The pace matches almost precisely the rate at which the British pound lost its reserve share between 1945 and 1965. The significance of that comparison will become clear in the final chapter. Now, look at the trade data. In 2022, India began purchasing Russian crude oil at discounted prices following the invasion of Ukraine. Russia, cut off from dollar clearing by U.S. sanctions, needed alternative payment channels. India needed cheap energy. The rupee-ruble settlement mechanism they constructed was improvised. It had documented operational difficulties, but it worked. By mid-2023, India was importing approximately 2 million barrels per day of Russian oil. A significant portion was settled in rupees or through third-country currencies. This is documented in Reserve Bank of India communications. It is corroborated by shipping data from KP Alir and Vortexa. These two energy data firms use vessel tracking records as primary evidence of transaction flows. The Saudi-China development is more structurally significant. In March 2023, Saudi Aramco and China's CNOOC completed the first yuan-denominated oil trade. The transaction was modest in volume. The signal was not. Saudi Arabia created the dollar-only oil pricing system in 1974. It had now accepted a non-dollar payment for oil for the first time. Saudi Aramco's public filings confirmed the transaction's terms and settlement currency. CNOOC's exchange disclosures on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange confirm the same. Saudi Arabia's broader positioning reinforces the significance. In December 2022, Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Riyadh for the first China-Arab summit. The joint communique was signed by the participating heads of state. It explicitly called for expanding the use of the Shanghai Petroleum and Natural Gas Exchange. This expansion was for yuan-denominated oil and gas settlements. This is a direct Saudi commitment in writing. It commits to the institutional infrastructure of non-dollar oil trading. The BRICS New Development Bank provides the multilateral dimension. The NDB was established in 2015 by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It has progressively shifted its lending toward local currency financing. Its 2023 annual report documents 22% of approved financing denominated in currencies other than the dollar. For energy sector loans, specifically, the local currency share runs higher. The bank is explicitly building the financial infrastructure for a non-dollar trading architecture. The BIS data provides the macro context. The 2022 triennial survey showed the renminbi's share of global FX trading had reached 7%. This was up from 4% in 2019. It was essentially zero in 2010. This growth operates from a low base. The dollar's 88% share remains dominant, but the direction of movement is consistent across every data set. It is consistent across every time period examined. The IMF published an analysis in 2023 noting an unusual pattern in the reserve shift. The dollar's lost share was not moving to the euro, yen, or pound. Those are the traditional alternative reserve currencies. Instead, it was distributing across a wider basket. This basket includes the renminbi and smaller national currencies. IMF economists describe this as evidence of fragmentation rather than simple currency substitution. Fragmentation matters. It describes a fundamentally different kind of transition than the one the world experienced in 1944. When the dollar replaced the pound, one dominant currency replaced another. The current data shows movement toward a more distributed system. Multiple currencies are sharing reserve functions across different trade blocks. This architecture is structurally more resistant to centralized pressure. The pressure is applied through the American sanction system. The limited economic effect of the dollar clearing restrictions applied to Russia after 2022 makes this concrete. Russia's economy contracted in 2022, but it recovered faster than most Western projections anticipated. The IMF and World Bank published separate assessments. Both attributed the faster-than-expected recovery to rapid development of alternative payment channels. These channels ran through China, India, Turkey, and the UAE. The sanctions worked less effectively than previous applications. They relied on a dollar clearing monopoly. The monopoly was already less complete. The architecture is not broken. The dollar's 88% FX share remains dominant. Its 58% reserve share remains dominant. But the parts of the system most dependent on universal dollar participation are no longer universal, and the pace of departure is accelerating. The most documented precedent for what the world is experiencing now is the dissolution of Britain's sterling area. This history provides the only verified roadmap for what a reserve currency transition looks like across multiple decades. The parallels are close enough to be analytically useful and different enough to require precision. The sterling area was the network of countries pegging their currencies to the British pound and holding their reserves in sterling. At its peak in the 1930s, it encompassed most of the British Empire and a number of independent nations. Its function was comparable to the petrodollar system in one key structural respect. Participating countries denominated their international trade in a single currency, and this gave Britain financial advantages analogous to those the United States has held since 1974. The system began fracturing in 1931. Britain had been the world's largest creditor nation and the center of global finance through the 19th century. World War I changed the arithmetic permanently. Britain borrowed heavily from the United States to finance the war. It emerged from the conflict as a net debtor for the first time in living memory. The United States emerged as the world's largest creditor nation. In September 1931, Britain suspended the gold standard. The pound fell 25% against the dollar within weeks. Countries holding sterling reserves suffered immediate and measurable paper losses. Some converted to dollars. Others remained within the sterling area, not because the system was strong, but because exiting was disruptive and dollar alternatives were scarce. The sterling area formalized in this period as a defensive arrangement, held together by dependency rather than strength. For the petrodollar system, the equivalent moment was August 1971, when Nixon closed the gold window. One critical difference separates the two. In 1931, Britain's anchor broke under external financial pressure. In 1971, the United States chose to break its own anchor unilaterally. The American system then rebuilt itself on oil through the 1974 deal. Britain in 1931 rebuilt on informal imperial preference and colonial trade ties. Both rebuilt systems lasted roughly 25 to 30 years before reaching terminal structural stress. The period from 1931 to 1938 in Britain's experience saw the sterling area functioning and even growing, with some countries actually joining the preference system during the 1930s, while internal contradictions accumulated beneath the surface. This maps to the period from approximately 1974 through the early 2000s for the petrodollar system, when dollar dominance reached its measured peak, even as the underlying fiscal vulnerabilities the system enabled were compounding. In Britain's case, the period from 1938 to 1945 was maximum stress concealed by wartime necessity. Allies needed British coordination regardless of sterling's structural weakness. The equivalent for the petrodollar runs from approximately 2008 to 2022. The global financial crisis of 2008 and the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 reinforced dollar dominance in the short term, as global crises always do. In every financial emergency, the most liquid currency attracts the most flight capital. Crisis is the dollar's strongest moment. The sterling area saw the same pattern in 1939 and 1940. The decisive break for Britain came not from gradual erosion, but from a specific event with a specific date. The 1956 Suez Crisis. Britain and France, acting alongside Israel, invaded Egypt in October 1956 to reclaim the Suez Canal following Gamal Abdel Nasser's nationalization of it. The United States, under President Eisenhower, opposed the invasion. The U.S. Treasury held substantial sterling reserves and threatened to sell them into the market, which would have caused a sterling collapse. The British government, facing both military failure and financial ruin, backed down. The humiliation was total and public. The world saw, for the first time without ambiguity, that Britain no longer controlled its own foreign policy because it no longer controlled its own financial position. The sterling area began its formal dissolution within months. Sterling convertibility ended permanently in 1967. The lesson is structural, not anecdotal. Reserve currency power is not lost through gradual erosion alone. It is lost when a specific event makes the dependency visible and humiliating to all participants simultaneously. Before Suez, the sterling area's weaknesses were known but politely unexamined. After Suez, they were undeniable. For the petrodollar system, the question historians and policymakers now examine is the same. What is the Suez moment? The 2022 freezing of Russian foreign exchange reserves deserves direct attention. When the United States and its allies froze approximately $300 billion in Russian sovereign reserves held in Western financial institutions, including dollar reserves at the New York Fed and euro reserves at Euroclear in Belgium, every non-Western government with substantial dollar holdings took notice. China held approximately $3 trillion in dollar-denominated assets at the time. Saudi Arabia held hundreds of billions. India, Brazil, the Gulf states all held dollar reserves. They had watched a sovereign nation lose access to its own assets by political decision. The message required no translation. Dollar reserves are secure until the United States decides they are not. And the United States decides. The IMF documented the acceleration of reserve diversification in the quarters following the Russian reserve freeze. The 2022 and 2023 COFR data show the sharpest single-year reductions in dollar reserve share in the database's full history. This is not the Suez moment for the petrodollar. The Russian reserve freeze did not trigger a sudden systemic break, but it functioned as what historians of the sterling area call a trigger event, a moment when the costs of dependency become viscerally clear to participants who had previously treated the system as permanent and neutral. The sterling area took 25 years from its first crack in 1931 to formal dissolution in 1956. The IMF COFR data shows the petrodollar's reserve share beginning its sustained decline in 2001. If the pace follows Britain's documented experience, the structural transition runs through the mid-2020s toward the late 2040s. The 2022 reserve freeze and the 2023 yuan oil trades place the current moment at roughly the 1938 equivalent in Britain's timeline. Visible stress, institutional alternatives under active construction, no collapse yet, but the internal logic of the old system increasingly questioned by its own core participants. The sterling area's dissolution did not destroy Britain. Britain remained a significant economy. London remained a global financial center. Sterling remained a tradable international currency. What the dissolution ended was the specific power derived from sterling's reserve status, the capacity to run deficits at others' expense, the political leverage over dependent economies, and the insulation from ordinary financial discipline. The parallel for the United States is precise. A decline in petrodollar dominance does not mean American economic collapse. It means the erosion of specific structural advantages, lower borrowing costs on government debt, the sanctions architecture built on dollar clearing, and the deficit financing made possible by guaranteed foreign demand for Treasury bonds. These are not small advantages, but they are finite ones, and their finiteness is now visible in the data. The BIS data puts numbers to what remains. The dollar accounts for 88% of all foreign exchange transactions. The COFR data shows dollar reserves at 58% of the global total, down from 73%, but still the single largest reserve currency by a substantial margin. The renminbi sits at 7% of FX transactions and approximately 2.5% of global reserves. The transition, if it follows the sterling area timeline, is measured in decades, not years. But within those decades, the decisions made now are the ones historians will later identify as the formative moments. The March 2023 yuan oil trade, the Russian reserve freeze of February 2022, the BRICS NDB local currency lending programs, the China-Arab Summit communique on Shanghai exchange pricing. These are the documents future economic historians will read, the way you now read the Kissinger cables from 1974. Henry Kissinger died in November 2023 at age 100. The architecture he built in 1974, the agreement between the United States and Saudi Arabia that made the dollar the price of energy, and therefore the price of the global industrial system, outlived him by barely a year in its original undiluted form. In March 2023, 8 months before his death, Saudi Arabia accepted yuan for oil for the first time. The system he built is not finished. The dollar's dominance in global trade remains a structural reality measured in the tens of trillions of dollars of daily transaction volume. But for the first time in 50 years, the founding participant in the original agreement is publicly building alternatives. You now know what the petrodollar system is, where it came from, how it worked mechanically, and what the documented primary source evidence shows about its current trajectory. The next video in this series traces the sterling area's dissolution in full detail, with the primary sources, the specific figures who made the terminal decisions, and the precise sequence of events from the 1931 crack to the 1956 break. Britain's full reserve currency collapse is already written history. Every document is in the archive. Every decision has been studied. The only open question is how closely the current transition follows the path the British evidence maps out. Stay with us for that one.